Okay, so to recap, this was, this is a new direction in my lab. And so I'd be excited to talk with all of you afterwards, any important feedback, brickbats, So before I begin the science of it, I would like to thank the people that have actually done the work. Dr. Dan Keppel, he's off to Facebook soon, but he did most of the heavy lifting in this project. Our current collaborators on the mouse side, funding sources for their faith in our ideas and for letting us keep the lights on. Okay, so in the spirit of what our evening's festivities are leading us to, two mice walk into a bar. Let's say they have been trained to do a task, something similar to what many of you heard today, something skilled. So let's say they can do a task that involves something like juggling, for example. So the current state of the art, right? Like as neuroscientists, we live in this era of explosive neurotechnological advances, and so the way to understand how their brains are producing the hand-eye coordination, how the neural dynamics is producing this behavior and so forth, involves exploiting multi-area recordings, populations of interacting, intercommunicating brain regions, and recordings over longer and longer periods of time. So typically you would get high dimensional data sets that somehow look like this cartoon, neural activity plotted as a function of time, one for mouse A, one for mouse B, and you can see the many neural pixels cartoon that I have approximated over here. So then, looking at this, experimental neuroscientists as well as theorists, we make use of,
I'm just gonna remove this.
Oh, okay, got it. Yes, please, that would help.
I can't really see.
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
I don't care. I truly don't care. I can tell you whatever important data was hidden behind their faces. Or you can ask them, All right, so, experimentalists and theorists like me, we employ dimensionality reduction techniques to make sense of these high dimensional data sets. And so dimensionality reduction techniques like PCA, GPFA, and so forth give you a coordinate space in which you could plot population activity that is collected from mouse A and mouse B. If this is a trial-based structure, you could find some kind of spread around these low-dimensional manifolds, one for mouse A, one for mouse B, and you can start to make inferences about the essential latent patterns from this high-dimensional data set. So this is by no means news to any of you who've been at any Cosyne literally before. Many people, many labs have worked on these types of dimensionality reduction, manifold-based analyses, subspaces, and so forth. So that is the state space view. There's an entire workshop on geometries, actually. So this would be your exit strategy. So these types of manifold analyses also lend themselves to making principled models, right? So how do you build models that capture the latent dynamics or these low dimensional manifolds? And so you can build yourself a model, one for mouse A and one for mouse B. So the key strength of models like, and my lab has done something similar also. So the key strength of models is that you can make predictions at a different level from the level at which they were built. So if I'm building a neural network model in which I am capturing the neural dynamics, then the hope and prayer is I can make predictions about behavior. If I train a network with backprop to just match the behavior, hope and prayer is I can kind of essential features of the dynamics that would have led to the behavior in the first place. So those models have been incredibly powerful. What vanishes behind people's faces is the word predictions. So that's the strength of approaches like this. Now imagine a scenario in which the mice are indistinguishable. The mice are experts. They've shown you they can juggle. They walked in from different places, but let's say they're identical. Their state space squiggles were identical, right? Then the same kind of principled model here, model A, would fit the behaviors of both of these, right? And the neural dynamics of both of these. But what if these mice learned differently? One of these mice walked in from a lab in New York, another from a lab in Boston, right? How did the learning trajectories of those mice how will you be able to tell what the learning trajectories were if you just examined the experts? So that is to set the stage for inferences of learning mechanisms. So that's not to say that this is the only way. I'm here to offer you an alternative perspective. The way we're currently doing it is by analyzing experts or completely trained models built to match experts. And so our inference of learning mechanisms is built on conjecture and hypothesis, and there's a place for that. But what if we could examine learning rules by following learning trajectories directly? And so that's the motivation for my talk. So if mouse A and mouse B learned differently, the question I want to ask is, can we infer the types of learning rules that are in play in artificial or biological brains by doing something with these types of models? So enter the spiritual connection of this technique called curriculum learning. Curriculum learning has an analogy to psychophysical shaping, or this protocol that experimentalists use frequently. Athena has done some famous work on this. In terms of being able to train animals to do the behavior, it is usually accomplished in tasks, in stages, and animals go from naive to expert over a period of time. So using that, we could use models that have been trained by means of curricula to model the trajectory taken during the process of task acquisition. We could use those types of models to direct better data collection. So for example, if a task involved learning some kind of abstract role, when in the learning process should you look for that cognitive signal? Where should you record to find it? And at what time scale should it vary? And so that's what I mean by the word, mechanism over here. And ideally, because I'm a theorist, I would like to write down a theory of learning in the brain, if there is such a thing to be found. So neuroscience tasks are often taught to lab animals by shaping, as I just mentioned. And the spiritual analogy I want to set up is curriculum learning models to the shaping animals are under. And I say the word spiritual over and over, and that I'm not making a literal analogy, right? Because a lot of animal shaping, as I've learned now, involves just getting the mouse or the rat to not freak out when you put it in the rig, or the macaque not to freak out. So I'm kind of pretending those things don't exist. So, I want to pick a task. So I want to model the trajectory during the process of learning a time-extended task. And in the papers that are upcoming and some papers that we've published, we've looked at a battery of different tasks. But let's pick one that's familiar to a lot of us, which is a working memory-based decision-making task. And the reason is because that's taught to animals by a process of shaping. And there's gobs and gobs of data from many different labs on tasks similar to this one. So you will see, I hope, a video playing. Yeah, there you go. So that's a video of a cartoon mouse moving. This is the T-SNE of the literal network with the patterns of pulses that the animal sees while it's navigating. The animal is rewarded if it makes a turn to the side that had more pulses or towers that it saw. So there's auditory versions of the task, visual versions of the task. This is done on undergraduates, rats, mice, and so forth. So mine is the neural recordings, but that's frowned upon. And so the goal here again is to be able to, one question you can ask is, can you design a better curriculum that could, help you train your animals more efficiently and, have failed curricula happen less. And of course, my goal is to eventually write down something like this. But to narrow this down to a problem we can solve in the next 15 or so minutes that I've got is this question: can models trained by curricula, or if I can train network models in a manner that is similar to the way animals are shaped, can I understand anything about the types of learning rules that might be in play, rather than conjecturing about it reverse from the expert stage? So this is just a reminder, there's going to be three components to it, right? One is the fact that there's going to be a task suite, there's going to be a bunch of curricula, and there's going to be different types of learning rules. So that's just to say what we're going to look at. So this is a simplified schematic of the same video you saw before. There's going to be two task variants, which are variants on the same theme. One is the standard evidence accumulation. Pretend that the animal's walking left to right around this corridor, and that's the Q period. When the Q period ends, it turns to the side or makes a decision to the side that contained the majority of cumulative evidence. There's another variant of this, which is a delayed decision period, where the Q period and the actual decision are interrupted by a delay period of varying length. During the delay period, there are no there's no sensory evidence to indicate which side the animal should go or the person should indicate or whatever. So this relies more on working memory through a time extended period without informative cues than the first variant. And we're going to model this in a network, and we're going to present trials that change the schedule of information that is presented from trial to trial. So note very carefully that I'm not defining curricula by means of just increasing difficulty, although that is the knee-jerk and that is one possible default. I'm defining curricula to be a much broader class. So anything that involves presenting or scheduling information to the learning agent in a systematic manner could be defined as a curriculum. So in that scheme, let me show you 3 different curricula that form part of this specific project for these 2 tasks. One of them you can imagine is, so time goes on the x-axis left to right, y-axis tells you the course number. So as you go from the bottom to the top on the y-axis, you can imagine that you're lengthening the Q period gradually, which is something you might imagine you do to the animal while you're training it to accumulate evidence over a long period of time. So over a bunch of trials, the evidence period gets longer and longer. So that's one possible syllabus. Another possible syllabus is that, there's the Q period length is fixed, but you're slowly increasing the duration of the delay period as you go from the bottom to the top on the y-axis. Another possibility is discrepancy reduction. So you could imagine that as you go from the bottom to the top, the number of pulses, the absolute value of the number of things you see on the left and the number of things you see on the right get closer and closer. So yes, while I did preface this by saying you can design curricula that don't necessarily dial up the difficulty, I'm actually showing you something that does dial up the difficulty. That's just to say that narrowing the problem down to something we can now wrap our heads. So 3 different types of curricula. Now, in addition, I want to disambiguate classes of learning groups. So we can pick one that should be familiar to a lot of us, standard like backprop, where the loss function is just computed on a single output or a low dimensional behavioral output. So let's say if this weren't a mouse going from naive to expert, if this is a neural network model, then Z of T is just the weighted output like a behavioral level target. And that is at every time step matched to some idealized target you can cook up. So that's very standard target-based backprop. Learning errors only on the output. Now, another variant or class of learning rules you can imagine would be one in which, while going from naive to expert, you're changing the activations or the actual neural dynamics within the brain to help you solve the task. So how does that work? You could have a loss function that now incorporates a representational loss or a neural loss. And one example, and so then, the simplest version of this is you take backprop and slap on an additional cost function. So all of a sudden, you're working in the category of a higher dimensional error in the neural dynamics than you had in the error that's computed only on the behavior. And so one possibility for the kind of tasks I showed you is that you're affecting in the activations directly, something like the discrepancy. Right? You could be computing, if I want to record from a region, what am I reading out? So if I want to read out something like discrepancy, that would be a nice thing to represent in the neural dynamics, right? So I can introduce that as a representational loss. So we have now 2 task variants, 3 curricula, and we have 2 types of learning rules. And within those categories, we can, play pin the tail a lot, this example, that example, and the whatabouts. But here are 2 examples I'm going to show you today. All right, so the first thing I want to say is why we pick tasks that are difficult for RNNs. And when I say recurrent neural network models, I mean only vanilla RNNs. You can discuss with me what happens if you use gated ones or transformers and so forth, and we can discuss that. But for vanilla RNNs, these tasks are difficult. So if you take the expert or the final version of the task, so what you see plotted here on the y-axis is the cumulative percentage of the number of networks that have completed a certain task or this task. So you can see that in the plain evidence accumulation task, the backprop, the regular vanilla target-based backprop does what it does, not spectacular, but then the backprop representation does really well. Both of those learning rules fail the delayed version of the task spectacularly. They just don't learn it. The x-axis here is a number of weight updates, which in our case, we learn the weights at the end of every trial. So the number of trials, number of weight updates, time, they're all used interchangeably. So these tasks are designed to be hard because I want to show you an example that you can latch onto. It doesn't have to be that way. Now, turns out that if you train, so what we're calling this is also a curriculum. This is just something we call a null curriculum. Turns out curriculum learning can rescue this failure mode of both of these tasks and to different degrees. So let me tell you what that means. So here's the evidence accumulation task. Once again, you see the cumulative percentage of the networks that can do the task as a function of weight updates, right? So in the evidence accumulation task, you can see the behavior-based one has, the null one, which was orange before, is now the red curve. And you can see that there's a speed up in learning to two different curricula, right? So in response to the evidence elongation curriculum, as well as the discrepancy reduction curriculum, regular backprop, your run-of-the-mill backprop, experiences speed up in learning. You don't see that appreciably in the representational version. Now, remember the delayed decision task with both networks, with both types of learning principles famously failed. They also get rescued, but to different degrees to different curricula. So the target-based vanilla version responds very well to the delay elongation one. The representational one has a much bigger, it has a bigger speed up to the delay elongation one, and to a lesser degree to the discrepancy reduction one. So the discrepancy reduction one can disambiguate the two tasks and the two curricula, and the delayed decision task has different performance with different types of learning rules. So really, if you take nothing away from my talk, take home just this. Different learning rules can respond to and benefit from different types of curricula differently. And you can therefore use networks trained by means of curricula to be able to disambiguate learning principles. So that's the basic message. Okay, so what do the internal representations look like, right? So let's say you've put these networks through this battery of curricula and you've gotten them to train, you've gotten them to juggle like the mice do. Well, not really, they're evidence accumulating, so let's not get carried away. So you will see a bunch of these squiggles in state space, so I want to take you through one of them carefully. So here's one single RNN. This has been trained by means of a curriculum. It's now in its expert state. Let me play it while I'm talking at you. Okay. And so this is the test set. Each dot is one task over time. So what you see over time is the dots diverging. They're not getting more numerous. The colors blue and the red are the number left minus number right, the absolute values. The size of the dots tell you the cumulative evidence, which is the sum of the number of pulses and number of pulses on the left and the right. This is in principal component space, and the axes are normalized to the length of the eigenvalues. So yes, indeed, as we expect, they do kind of form fixed points in state space, right? Because we know what to do with integration type things. We know what we're looking for, and that's what happens. And in fact, now when you look at all of them, so now I'm showing you both the tasks, evidence accumulation and delayed decision. I'm showing you all curricula and all the learning principles. And this is now networks that have been trained by means of a curriculum. They're all in their expert state. So you're seeing the test performance of networks that have been trained by means of different learning rules and different curricula. And at the end, they all look the same. So the question that one might ask, yes, the mouse learned in New York and one mouse learned in Boston, but the mouse that learned in New York may be able to, navigate public transport better. And yes, it's possible. But what I'm showing you is a rubric, a different way of disambiguating learning rules. And you can't distinguish these particular mice because they're all making fixed points in state space, identical ones, regardless of the curriculum they followed. And so now we can, we quantified this. We looked at the relationship between discrepancy, the quantity you can read out from these networks, as a function of the first principal component. And we looked at them across all of these conditions, and they're all regular and they all follow the tanh. So the representations and what you can read from these experts are also indistinguishable in the finally trained state. And that's further quantified here. So we wanted to pick metrics that you would normally use on your experimental data, or we would use on models, right? So we look at effective dimensionality. And again, orange is the regular target-based backprop. The blue is this representational version that we've cooked up. And the columns tell you, the first one is the curriculum, the second one is the effective dimensionality, and the third one is the correlation between the discrepancy and the first principal component. And they're all indistinguishable. Conversely, by looking at the actual, see, now this is where I wish the faces were gone, but I'll just tell it to you and you'll believe it. So the performance during different curricula is different. So now what you see here is the completion time of various curricula as a function of the curriculum. The closed boxes are evidence accumulation, and the open boxes are the delayed version of evidence accumulation. And this is relative to the null. You can see that, that relative to the null, different curricula do indeed respond differently to different types of, different learning rules respond to different curricula differently. Now, to really quantify this further, we wanted to do some statistics on it. So what we did was bootstrap. So now there's a lot going on here, so let me guide you through this slowly. First, the colors. The orange is a regular backprop through time, target-based. Error is only computed at the behavior level. The backprop through like representational backprop is something where you've changed the neural activations to help you do the task. So that's the thing in the blue. The opacity of each of these dots tells you how many networks were simulated. So we start with 2 networks per learning rule per curriculum, all the way up to 50 networks per learning rule per curriculum. Then each of these dots is further bootstrapped a few hundred times. And the axes that you see here is that whatever curriculum I'm looking at relative to null. And this is basically training. All I'm telling you painstakingly is training a classifier, and classifier can indeed predict the difference between the learning rules. So now if I take up each pair of dots by its opacity, right? Each pair of dots now tells you how many samples were tested, right? That I can quantify much more rigorously over here. So now this is the accuracy of the prediction of being able to tell apart learning rules as a function of the number of samples per curriculum. And you can see curriculum completion time far outperforms any of the other metrics that we could initially think of. So just by looking at performance or speed up or relative performance on different curricula, you might be able to draw different conclusions of what types of signals you're looking for. If you're concluding that something is learning by a target-based metric, you might be better off really literally looking for something that looks like a gradient. If you're looking for something that changes activations, you might want to look for something that's an instructive signal. Something that, to quote Ethan Bromberg-Martin, learns fast and forgets fast, and then transfers the learning somewhere else that learns slowly and forgets slowly. But in order to pick the signal that learned fast and forget fast, you want to also know when during the training cycle you want to record and what time scale that thing varies at. So to conclude, we can classify types of learning rules. And so the project is about being able to tell apart learning rules by means of curricula. I showed you 2 task variants, 3 different curricula, and 2 classes of learning rules with 1 example each. You can imagine doing this for any kind of classification, really, including vanilla RNNs versus LSTMs or whatever. But in order to learn about learning, I think you have to kind of study it literally. So what we've shown you, what I hope I've shown you today, is that we've inverted the learning and curriculum problem. And what I mean by that is a traditional, like if I were, truly an engineer instead of an engineer wannabe, I would want to build a curriculum that most efficiently teaches a thing something. And we heard this provocative talk earlier about teaching AI how to communicate, right? That would be the straightforward way of doing it. We're introducing a paradigm shift, and we're trying to say, can we use performance during curricula or curriculum learning to be able to tell apart learning? So I think that was basically it. There was one more thing which we could pontificate about later, but I would like to thank Dr. Keppel again and wish him, adios on his greener pastures. Thanking you all for your attention and funding sources for your faith.